Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Nathan, I want to talk about something that sounds a little abstract at first, so let me open up with a little story.
This is basically our entire podcast. But anyway,
yes,
go ahead.
It is. Well, all that to say, this could not actually be more practical. So, Jonathan Haidt, who most of our listeners will be familiar with Jonathan Haidt. He's, of course, back in he's just released The Anxious Generation, which some of you are probably reading. But I'm thinking of a time where he was on a panel at New York University where he teaches. And New York University has been in the news intermittently for student protests. It's kind of a flashpoint for a lot of the progressive outcries
about what you would expect for
an
institution named New York University.
Pretty much. It's very on brand, you might say.
Right.
So in this particular panel discussion, it's Jonathan Haidt and three other professors and one student. And the student, I would put her at about 18 to 20 years old. So, I mean, very young and, surrounded by these accomplished academics. And at one point, this is just sort of an aside. Now, the student, she represents, I guess, how would I characterize her viewpoint? I mean, she would be pretty much a typical progressive, very much drawing her. I mean, her thinking is basically structured by critical theory. So that ought to explain it, I think, enough. And so her and Haidt have some disagreements, especially when it comes to how to talk about difficult subjects in the classroom and that sort of thing. But at one point, there's this aside where she says, well, you'll notice that our whole, our city, everything around us is designed for able-bodied people. And they kind of, just sort of stare at her, deadpan. And she says, and that's not an accident. That's by design. And, the implication of what she's saying is that there seems to be some form of serious discrimination that's embedded in the architecture of our cities, and also that there's something wrong with a world that is set up to accommodate people who are normative in some sense. Because, I mean, the obvious answer to her is, look, of course, I'm grateful for wheelchair ramps and all of these accommodations, but most of the population are able-bodied. And so, therefore, it makes perfect sense
for most of the subway systems to have stairs.
Exactly. That the whole city is set up. There's no conspiracy afoot, but there is a normative way for people to, walk around. There is such a thing as a healthy, normal human body. And to say that is not tantamount to discrimination. But I think this student would say that it is. And Nathan, I know you've got some interesting stories about, I think you had an interesting story that took place after a Q&A session where somebody talked about was it their very eyesight? Yeah.
Right. So this was not a talk that I had given. I was listening in on, this is a post Q&A conversation. This would have been like 20, as maybe more when critical theory was more of a, I think at some of the conversation I was tapering off some, but at this point, the one young lady, different skin color than myself, and I was listening in on the conversations. I was like, just something doesn't make sense here to me in the way that this is going. And then all of a sudden she said, I have to recognize that I'm an oppressor because I can see. And that means that everyone who can't see is a victim of my able-bodiedness. And I thought, okay, like everything fell together for me right there. Of you're thinking that you're automatically oppressing another category because you have being able to see is a phenomenal blessing and privilege in life. Let's call it what it is. That is something to thank God for. And being visually impaired, that changes your life. However, the interaction between, unless you went and blinded somebody, or were trying to go out of your way to hit people with white sticks with your car, the degree to which you're an oppressor because you're able-bodied is not, for most of us, okay, I'm going to say this is normal. For most of us, we would say the link between victim and oppressor is not clear to us there. There's privilege and there are accommodations that we all need in different aspects of our lives. But yeah, so this young lady, I haven't seen the clip you're referring to, was kind of living in that world where the normative is the majority is always an oppressor of the minority. And that's the problem with normalcy.
Right. So the reason I'm bringing this all up is because, and we'll link this in the show notes. There's an interesting article that appeared in First Things magazine by, let me make sure she's a new writer for me, but Mary Harrington. And in this article, and it's a heady piece, you have to do some thinking with it, but again, it has deeply practical outworkings. She says at one point in the article, look, let me just indulge in a little bit of the kind of, I don't know, sort of angry tactics of our age and coin a phrase for what's happening to us here. And so she calls it normophobia. Normophobia.
Rolls right off the tongue.
Normophobia. Right. And so she's, of course, talking about this principled resistance to any kind of normative standards, or really any of what we previously would have said are just the basic givens of human life. And so a while back, I was at Emmanuel University, which is a school right up the street from me here in Georgia. And I had felt I was invited to do 2 consecutive chapel services, one week and then the next week. And so I thought, I'm speaking to college students, and I was informed this was a complex student body. This is ostensibly a Christian university, but there are a lot of non-Christians who are there. So I was prayerfully considering my remarks, and I thought, well, the 2 major issues that we're facing in our culture, I think, just if you could just spell them out in broad terms, are massive confusion. So confusion and fear. And I wanted to look at each of those. The first week, I talked about confusion. And I approached it by looking at what I think is the central question of our age. And she says this in the article too, by the way. What does it mean to be human? And I think I brought this up before. I think this is a profound question, but a deeply unhealthy question. It points to a serious confusion. If we tend to ask, what does it mean to be human in times of crisis? Whether that's chattel slavery, the question of what a person is, came to the forefront with great urgency.
Deeply. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And we're asking the question now under very different circumstances, but these are circumstances of profound spiritual anguish right now. Now, the language of our culture is going to be, it's a mental health crisis. I'm less and less fond of that phraseology because we tend to translate all of that into purely medical or physical terms, when these are in fact spiritual problems that involve first and foremost our estrangement from our maker. And then everything else falls apart from there on. That just follows from that. But I talked about how we human beings are peculiar creatures. Uniquely on the planet, we're the ones we have to be told who we are. Nobody has to inform a tiger of what it is, or a nightingale, or a cactus, or anything else. But we do. We need to be told who we are. And of course, we're operating in a cultural moment right now where that is fiercely resisted. The notion is that, no, the only person who can define you, who can tell you who you are, is you yourself. And so if that's your resting assumption, I'm just trying to spell this out in very basic terms rather than relying on a bunch of philosophical language here, just to make this very clear.
Well, let me make sure we're tracking with you here, because
all
right, here we have conflicting narratives of what's normal. You're saying what's normal is for you to be told who you are, and you're living in a world where normal is for you to define who you are. All right, how can you not have a conflict there?
Well, and how I'm trying to also I'm trying to demonstrate a little bit of how did we get to a place where anything that's normal is seen to be oppressive. Because let's be
Okay.
crystal
Let me
clear.
say what you're going to say, because I think it's what I was going to say.
Well, yeah. So there anything, it's one thing to recognize eyesight, for instance, as a privilege. Absolutely. And the joy of seeing the world as it is. And it's a privilege that not everybody has. Does that make you an oppressor? Of course not. That's a line of thinking that is deeply misguided. It doesn't
Okay.
make you an oppressor. If you're able-bodied, it doesn't make you an oppressor. So the very notion, but why would something that's quote unquote normal be seen as something that is discriminatory or worse, something that is kind of a violation or something that puts you in the role of an oppressor?
Okay, let me try to answer this. So we can look, you can demonstrate this looking throughout history, times in which groups who have been the majority have oppressed groups who have been the minority. Is everybody on board with me here? That has
Yes.
happened. Yeah, we're not denying any of that. What we're saying is that is not the correlation and the causation are not linked there in the same way that people are making it seem. So if you're looking at it as a zero sum game of the people who are winning are only winning at the expense of the people who are losing. That's a very finite
Mm-hmm.
resource vision of reality. And if it doesn't have a clear distinction of like what it means to be a healthy human, then there's going to be openness to saying, um, somebody's winning and somebody's losing in every interaction, which is the opposite of the definition of justice, by the way. And it's also, a
Mm-hmm.
very reductionistic. It is an anti-abundance, and it is a severely inwardly focused way of thinking about how the world has really worked. And the statistics don't bear that out. But there might be um, part of it is like some of this is like the growing up thing, Cameron, of, you have kids. How long, like, if you think of
Yeah.
like common first phrases, that's not fair is probably, in the top 25 of
I
first
hear
full
it
sentences.
all the time. All the time. Yes.
So we are born with some sort of intrinsic radar to perceive injustices around us. And part of the parenting role is to help people see when something really is wrong, and other times say, hey, there's another reason that this happened, and it's not what you think it is. And like
Mm-hmm.
work that out early with your 4-year-olds, because that'll make them a fascinating 24-year-old if you don't. Um, so
Right.
like we do have this thing you were saying about humans are the only creatures that have to be told who they are. I'm working through this in the sense of like, okay, so I have some homing pigeons, right? That is a phenomenal creature that you can put them in a box and drive them around and they'll come home. Lots of animals do that. Salmon return to the
Mm-hmm.
place, where they were hatched, the whole gambit of just fascinating global navigation by animals.
Mm-hmm.
Without an iPhone. It's incredible. But here's the thing. A pigeon cannot tell its offspring to go someplace else or where it was born. It has to, like, it's the intrinsic ability is only one generational and it's non-linguistic. But uniquely, like my mother can tell me how to go find the place where she was born, even if I've never been there. And so
Mm-hmm.
one of the wild things about humanity is we have this linguistic, conceptual, spatial capacity to discuss reality in symbolic terms that map onto the real world around us, that give us this ability to use language to actually get a lot of fascinating stuff done. And that is normal. But the intrinsic element for humans, so you're saying that we have to be told who we are, but we do have an intrinsic, just like the homing pigeon knows how to go home. I think humans do have a sense of justice and fairness and rightness and wrongness that is percolating beneath the surface of our little identities and egos as we're forming, that can be, I think, properly contextualized in the sense of there being an almighty God, or warped in so many creative ways that it leads to this massive cultural chaos and confusion.
Well, one of the ways that C.S. Lewis is very sophisticated and he's able to talk about natural law theory in highly practical terms at the very opening section of Mere Christianity. It's masterfully done. And he starts with that sense of right and wrong. And basically, the big assumption that he draws is everybody knows, usually through their sense of fairness. What, he talks about, he's British, so he's going to talk about queuing, right? Getting in line. And when
Yeah.
people, try to hop ahead in the queue, this is deeply wrong, and people recognize that. But he recognizes that we have this innate sense of right and wrong, really, of justice. And we often spell it out in terms like, that's not fair. And we're acutely aware of it when we feel we have been violated, right? We always take ourselves off the hook. But he says two fundamental recognitions that are basically key to all sound moral thinking. One is there is a way we ought to live. Two, we don't live in that way. We routinely fall short of it. We recognize that we want to be treated in a certain way, and we want everybody to treat us this way fairly, but we also recognize that we don't live up to that standard, and we don't treat others that way. We have this kind of double standard. We expect it. We don't do it for everybody else. And he says that's the basis of all. We all have that. We're all endowed with a conscience. So we don't come into this world as blank slates. So that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is but our identity is given, not self-made. We do play a role in who we become, for better or for worse. That's true. But our identity is something it has more to do, it's more a process of discovery than of creation.
Yeah, and you're not, but let's be careful here. Cameron is not saying it's a process of discovery and like go to Tibet and sit on a mountain and find yourself. That's not what he means by discovery. He's meaning that there is a standard that you're learning to conform to, not that you find it from within yourself.
And also that we need to come to grips with, this is something people have known down the ages. We've only recently begun questioning things like this, but we've always taken for granted let's just call these givens, Nathan. The givenness, most of your life is given. Your life itself is given. You'll hear people spouting nonsense like, I didn't choose to be born, and that is nonsense. If we try to spell that out carefully, it's basic, and by nonsense I mean it's incoherent. You can only give voice to that kind of objection or that kind of complaint by drawing on the powers of existence itself. So it really doesn't make much sense. It's also a fundamental category mistake. Human beings we're not necessary beings at all. We're contingent beings.
Right. Yeah.
But so your life is given. And now these are the things that are being resisted. Notice your life is given. So, objections. I didn't choose to be born. I hear that more and more. Your name is given to you. Well, more and more people
first language.
Your language, your eye color, your nationality. Yes, your family. This is why in a lot of ancient literature, family is almost occupies a place similar to destiny in a lot of these. And we wrestle with that too. I don't want to become like my parents. I don't want to become like my father. But all of this is what's being resisted. So I'm going to change my name. I'm going to, and biology is not set in stone now. We have technologies that can help us. The only thing that's real for me is what's inside and what I'm feeling. This is the message of our culture. So that's what I mean when I say we're rejecting all of these givens. And what we can say here clearly is that it's not working.
Oh no, come on, Cameron. All you got to do is dye your hair blue and get a tattoo. Solves all your problems.
Right. And of course, but hovering above all of this is what's being called the mental health crisis, but which is really a spiritual crisis.
Okay.
And so so we've got that spiritual crisis going on where people are desperately lonely. They have no sense of meaning. They have no sense of purpose, and suicide rates are very high. They're surging, and that's not slowing down. So this is, and again, against the backdrop of this, we're increasingly having people tell us that the world is, any kind of normative standards are necessarily suspect and oppressive.
Okay, let me tell you why this is.
Yeah, trying to make it clear. Yeah.
Okay, this is Nathan's pontification here. Here's what I think is going on. Most systems do not know how to deal with something that deviates from the norm. So if we go back to the
Hmm.
historical example, people struggle to know what to do with deviance from the norm, from the outside
Hmm.
or the marginalized. And so the bulk of history has been geared toward people who don't quite fit in or tick all the boxes or whatever, getting pushed to the margins. Now, there are a few rare exceptions where they get the opposite happens, where the albino child in a foreign country becomes like a god or a goddess. Like it goes the other way, like a really
Sure.
unique
Yep.
thing gets. But for the most part, you're saying, here's somebody who doesn't fit in. So we now live in a culture where everybody feels like they don't fit in some category somewhere. Here's where I would say Christianity is interesting, and provides a counter narrative to this fear of the normal, is that Jesus spent a phenomenal amount of his ministry teaching people how to deal with people who are other than or didn't fit in, and often himself identified with the outside crowd
Mm.
and those who were in the middle, and gave them a vision of who God was, that he was loved by them, offered them salvation, frequently fixed many of their problems, and really worked hard there for them to have a clear vision of who they really were. If this is true, then Christianity, but this plays out throughout the history of the church, that Christianity does a phenomenal job and an outsized role of caring for the widow and the orphan and the person who
Hmm.
is experiencing financial hardships, the person who is disabled in their work. I mean, just go look through the types of ministries that the church constructs, where it has a clear vision of what is healthy and what is normal, and part of that vision comes to them from Christ, who then also instructs how to treat and deal with those who don't fit in well. Most worldviews,
Hmm.
I'm going to use the word worldview here, even though, we know how that, most ways of looking at the world
Yeah, sure.
don't have those same redemptive and
I'll allow it.
forgiveness
Hmm.
categories for the outlier, and they are excluded.
Yep.
And so if you do not have a practical, tangible concept of what it means to be forgiven or redeemed in the way that you treat other people, then you're going to assume that you will be rejected also anytime that you deviate from the definition of normal. And so I would say that the
Hmm.
fear of the normal is a tragic inability to see how there can be a standard that then embraces and includes those who don't match up for whatever reason. Jesus talked about this. Some people are born this way, some people are made this way, whatever it is. Um, that
Hmm.
Christianity uniquely has this category that defines normal and goes out of its way to prioritize the comfort and the care of those who don't check the cultural boxes in the same way. I think we have to recognize, again, this is me totally just making stuff up as I go here, but I think,
Hmm.
uh, so th- I can give examples of this. So there was a young lady who was at the senior citizens building advocating for something that nobody in there agreed with or had any clue what she was talking about. And she was sure
Hmm.
that they all hated her. And um,
Hmm.
at one point, my grandpa said to her, well, he said, we have a fundamental impasse going here because I disagree with you and I love you and respect you, but you don't think that's possible. And
Mm.
that therein, I think, lies the Christian challenge of this day, is that most people are operating with a mindset that if you don't accept or change your standard for everybody's whims, that you dislike them. Christianity has this built-in redemptive forgiveness, servant-hearted, reflexive capacity that makes being not normal not a condition for being ostracized. If we're
Hmm.
following what Jesus said correctly.
Well,
Does that I'm
right.
struggling to
That's
wrap all this together, but does that seem possible?
It does. Well, we need traditional categories to navigate this territory again. And so it seems to me, first of all, it's worth saying, because we just need the spell broken every now and then. It's worth saying there's nothing wrong with being, quote, normal. And normative standards are not a bad thing. Standards are not a bad thing. And so one
But
of
they also they
the
didn't
more
become that
disturbing features,
because of an abuse of power. This is the question though. Is
no,
did the norms become the
no.
standard because of an abuse of power, or just because they stabilized cultures and societies and work? And I would say
Yes.
some of both,
So
but by and large, it's, men and women having babies has
yeah,
been
they were
standardized because of
correct.
biology, not because of cultural or religious oppression.
No, no, men and women having babies in a stable, you know, household is the basis for a stable civilization. That's always been understood and only called into question in recent years. And of course, the more disturbing features of the article itself have to do with the ways in which many of these, somebody like a Wilhelm Reich, for instance, who we've brought up before, inveigh against the family unit, families in particular, because they see it as the incubator of oppressive conservative values, things like that. And so the trick is to hold on to some of
Yeah.
the benefits of the family, but really dissolve its bonds.
Yeah, so the family as a unit that maintains conservative values. Let's think about what's being said there. Yeah, because okay, a family that maintains conservative values like
And
independence
by the
from
way, I should
dependency
spell
on the
that out.
government.
I don't mean
Yeah,
well, and I'm not speaking so much about he doesn't have in mind right here some typical political conservative values that we think of right now. He means conservative in the sense of traditional right there, but
right.
he would see conservative in the political sense also included in that, but mainly what he means are just kind of traditional values, which for him, of course, and anybody in this camp are always suspect because they're always cloaking some form of corruption or some form of the attempt to consolidate power. So this is a deeply cynical view of human history.
But it's also a little bit opposite too. So let me be cynical in the other direction is think how a stable family is not as good for the economy as a broken one. And so like the idea of financial independence and independence from the government control, all kinds of things of mutually working like household economies, the whole 9 yards of, man, we could do a whole podcast on this. I'm saying there could, if you want to be cynical about it, there would be an economic motivation for destabilizing what's normal as well. And from just a government control and dependency category. Yeah, we don't want to go down that rabbit trail, but
let's get more,
that's there too.
Well, let's get more cynical for just a second. What's one of the biggest industries in America? One of the greatest, I mean, just in terms of its money every year. I mean, just one of the biggest economic factors. It's porn.
Porn, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a massive vested interest in keeping that vile, demonic machine going, isn't there? So I think you can look, the dissolution of the family can also serve the economic interests of people as well. And you're very right to bring that up here as well. But in large terms, I just want to give some takeaways here just to make this very practical. The normative is resisted in a world where you want to reject any kind of shared standard. Because if everything is so if you have a cultural moment where you think that the most authentic way to live, the best way to live is inwardly, and that you define your identity and define who you are, then normative standards are going to be a huge imposition, and they're going to be seen as a threat, and they're going to be seen as a violation. So because they impinge on our sense of freedom. Now, I would submit to you this is a deep misunderstanding of freedom. Freedom in its best sense is the freedom to become what you were made to be and to flourish as that, rather than, I think, the mode that we tend to adopt of negative freedom, just trying to do as much as we want with as little resistance as we want, tends to lead to bondage, actually, and addiction. And again, it's little surprise to me we are absolutely riddled with that in our country. So that's one of the outworkings of that spiritual crisis.
Let me throw in another word here that you often use, Cameron. I think this is me quoting you, quoting Os Guinness, who said that culture in its basic format and, basic definition would be a way of life lived together. And you cannot have culture without norms.
Impossible. Yeah. And so if you don't have some shared narrative, shared standards, common, an end in the sense of a goal, a telos. And that, when we're lacking that, we see the breakdown. But the other piece, I think, Nathan, and this goes to earlier to a lot of what you were saying, is that people who think in these terms. Let's go back to that student. And again, this student is about 18 years old, 20 years old. I mean, she's she's a bright student by all accounts. I don't want to give the impression to listeners that I'm trying to belittle her in any way. I mean, I shudder to think about some of the stuff that was coming out of my mouth when I was 18 years old. But she has ahead of her a lot of growth and a lot of experiences. And it'll be interesting to hear where some of these students, many of whom are protesters and all of who are so kind of up in our arms about some of these issues, where they will be in 10 years, 20 years, how they're thinking then. I'm very curious about that. But clearly, she's got deep ethical motivations behind what she's saying, and there's clearly a deep-seated care for the marginalized, for those who are disabled. And we can say that's okay, that's a laudable thing, that's a noble thing, but what's going wrong? I think a huge part of what's going wrong is, so we got the one hand, we've got any kind of normatives, standards assume just that. They assume a standard, and we fiercely resist that these days, and that leads to moral incoherence. But the second thing that really leads to moral incoherence is these people have no category for sin.
Okay. Yes.
And that's going to make this all a recipe either for very drastic, frightening political solutions or just despair. Because you just think, what is wrong with people? Why can't we just get it together? Why can't we treat each other well? Why? I mean, everywhere we look, we're finding corruption. And Christians, of course, would say, yeah, of course, human beings are fallen.
Yeah, but this is not
naive.
disconnected.
We have to assume.
So,
right.
So if you think of sin fundamentally as a violation of purpose, so if you think of sin as a violation of purpose, as a Christian, we do.
Right.
But then you map that onto a world who doesn't believe that there is a purpose. You can't violate a purpose if there is no purpose.
Other than the
so
purpose
there isn't going
you
to be
make.
sin. Right. So
yep.
What's the complaint?
Really,
it's
not you who's right.
It just is what it is.
See, that's where.
Where does the sense of oughtness come from? That's the question. Where does the sense of oughtness come from?
Right. Where does it come from? And clearly, people in this camp have it to a very high degree. I mean, most of the causes here are explicitly moral causes, but they lack a coherent moral vision. And this is where, you hesitate, but it really is true. Descriptively, this is quite powerful. Alistair McIntyre's term of emotionalism, which he brought out, he explores that in After Virtue, his great book that came out in 1981. But emotionalism just describes a phenomenon where everybody is using moral language, but really it's just personal preference. They're dressing personal preference up with moral language.
Let me answer your question, though. You said, where does this come from? It comes from the church. Mm-hmm. These people are stealing Christian ideas. Let's walk with me back. Yep. Walk with me back through the
cultural appropriation.
Yeah. So, all right, think about this. If you think of major historical figures that showed a deep concern for people who weren't able to walk, is anybody popping into your mind? It's Jesus.
Well,
if you haven't gotten there on your own, it's Jesus Christ.
It's not pagans.
It's not pagans. It's not communism. What they do with non-able-bodied workers who can't produce enough widgets in the factory. This is like Christianity 101. So I guess that's where, just to toot Jesus's horn there a little bit.
But again, if you have a view of history that omits sin as a category, human sin, human fallenness, you're going to fall into all of these very basic but very profound errors. And so somebody who has these lenses on could look back at some of these instances of altruism and say, yeah, well, there was clearly a power agenda at play here in what Christ was doing. Clearly,
yes, there was. Actually, in Jesus' case, there was a power agenda. It was him conquering evil and death.
Right.
But that's why Christianity is problematic, quote unquote, here, because nobody believes that power can be used well. And I'm highly skeptical of it as well, except for this one time. So therein lies part of the foundation of my Christian confidence.
And here's the double standard again, though. Everybody believes power corrupts and it can't be used well, but everybody wants it. I don't care how much you hear from a lot of these people saying, "Hey, we care about the marginalized, the disenfranchised. Your normative standards are bad." But what are they trying to do? Well, they're
give me $20 million
going to great lengths. Right. To take over the conversation, to silence opponents, legally silence opponents, and in a word, to get the power. Because again, and that makes perfect sense from a worldview that says it's all about power games. So get the power, use the media, do the slow march through the institutions, and capture the public imagination and get the power, so you can call the shots and get these oppressive people out of office. But it's still grabbing a grab for power. Again, it looks purely arbitrary and incoherent if you don't have a legitimate moral vision, and you don't have a legitimate idea of what's wrong with people in the first place.
Yeah.
What is humanity's problem?
Let me throw in two words here. So one, we've talked about this before, that somebody pointed out once that the word compassion is predicated on a moral judgment. So when you have compassion on
Right.
somebody, you look at the situation you're in and you say, that is wrong. And it is so wrong that I am moved to do something about it. That's what compassion is. Compassion turns into action, but it starts with a moral judgment to say that's wrong. A parallel category that you see this would be, people talk about fat phobia or the body positivity movement.
Right. Yes.
Where you just say, no,
Yep.
this is healthy. And every doctor's like, no, it's not. And that you're like, you're fat phobic.
Right.
And you're saying, no, it's unhealthy. This is not going to go well for you in life if you continue on this, in this direction. I think that's maybe there's a word in here that we should recapture at the end of this podcast, because normal maybe is a bit ambiguous, but what we can talk about is what is healthy. What is healthy for a human? And I'm not talking about healthy here in, body mass index. There's that is certainly a part of it, but also in terms of relationship. And the reason that I want to use the word healthy here is because I don't want people to think we're saying, well, what's normal is 2 parents and 2 kids and a dog and a white picket fence. Because from Jesus's perspective, that isn't.
Sure.
Jesus highly prioritized single people. The Gospels do in general. The New Testament does in general.
He himself was single.
He himself, right? So we can't. So we want to be careful that we're not adopting a cultural vision of normalcy, and then trying to, use Christian terms in order to justify that. I think what we want to look at is what is a healthy relationship with God, and what are the parameters of a healthy relationship with other people and with our own bodies and own identity, for sure. But that one's third on the list after proper relationship with God and other people. And so I like this idea of thinking about what is healthy. And then that means that the judgments that we make are done out of compassion, not out of high-horsedness or looking down our nose at anybody else. The world has plenty of that. But to say, how do I help other people live well according to what God has revealed to be what he intended? And so we're kind of going original intent here. That's what Jesus used when he was talking about God's will. What did God intend? And God intended life and health and
so
healthy
if we
relationships.
Want a standard.
Yeah. We just,
one of the
people are lacking the vision of the possibility of beauty and goodness in relationship with themselves, with God and other people. And that's kind of the work of the church, is to say, hey, this is a possibility and you're invited.
Yes. and so the vision is, in a word, Christ, the shape of his life, his life, death, and resurrection. And in him, we see a picture of purity and sanctity. And that's the healthy template that we have in a word. Just the same way that if doctors want to understand disease, they don't understand disease by studying disease. They understand disease by studying health first. In other words, a normal, healthy specimen. And this gives them the clarity to identify abnormalities. Yes, abnormalities. There are conditions that are abnormal in the sense that they're suboptimal for how your body functions. And the same is true of how you live as a human being in your spiritual health. And so the radiant spiritual vision that we have is Christ, and the people who serve as his hands and feet, who are his ambassadors, who are not perfect, but by his grace also give to us a picture of what true human flourishing looks like. But you have your standard, you have a face that you can point to, and you have the practitioners. And this is the answer. Grand political solutions are not going to do it. This is the answer. Once again, we be a saint, cultivate virtue.
Here's a little line that popped in my mind. I think named Robert Gagnon will be familiar with him. I think he teaches at a seminary in Pittsburgh.
Yep,
But I think it's
that's
one of the
right. Yep.
categories he was writing on sexual ethics. And he said, what's wild about Jesus, so you're talking about normal, you're talking about the standard. He said that Jesus simultaneously intensified the standard for righteousness and extended a hand to the prostitute and the sinner and the broken and the farthest end of it.
Mhm.
So he was holding really, really
Yep.
high standards and inviting people that nobody else believed he was, including and inviting them into that.
Right.
And Gagnon writes the Pharisees of the time couldn't wrap their heads around that. How do you have somebody who has such a high moral standard, hunger and thirst for righteousness as the goal, and then goes and dines with the tax collectors and the prostitutes? And Jesus' ability to do
Right.
that confused everybody then, and it boggles the mind of everybody now. And so if you can learn to be Christ-like in that way, there are going to be a lot of blank stares in your life. But I think it is the beauty of the image that God is calling us to. And if you want a sense of oughtness for how you should engage these things, you can't do any better than look to Christ for how to have high standards and include those who the culture and the society around us views as worthless, irredeemable, other than separate and outcast. So I don't know, Cameron. I keep getting pretty pumped about basic stuff that Jesus said.
Likewise. Yes. So we hope this has been helpful to you. Take a look at the article. I think it's eye opening, and I think it's very descriptive of some of what we're going through. But it ends on a good practical note where we can begin to not just think about these things, but push back in healthy ways against some of the trends around us. And I think the good news is more and more people are waking up to this and are seeing it clearly. So you have been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.